Hello, I'm BX2Cat. Welcome back to the second channel video. Today I have some more Geography of Toycat people. It's also a second channel series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I want to talk about a very significant part of the world for various different reasons, both positive and negative, because it is the United States of America, one of the larger countries in the world, one of the more significant countries, and also one of the countries which I feel like people know the least about when it comes to something that's literally in the name, the states, because the United States is a very unique country, at least for the time it was created, because it is a collective of 50 unique states that are kind of like independent countries in a lot of ways, that just kind of have an overarching federal government that kind of ties them all together. However, even people that live in the United States, even though they know there is 50 unique kind of individual states with their own little things, don't actually know all 50 of the states. And I figured, you know what, since outside of the US it's going to be next to impossible to get anywhere close to that, why not give you a guide to all 50 states in America with today's video, kind of like what I did with the guide to all the countries in Europe, to kind of just let you know where they all are and, you know, why they're significant, stuff like that. And hopefully you do all enjoy today's brief guide to all of the states in America. If you do, with that said though, let's get straight into it, and let's start by talking about the contiguous states of America, or the contiguous, I can't say the word properly, because there's 48 states which form the United States. Most people know this bit right here, but then obviously we've got Alaska, which is all the way up here, the largest US state by land area, because it's absolutely massive, as you probably work out. Obviously that's a map that's kind of skewed because of the Mercator, but still, it's a very, very, very large state, and it came from Russian America. It was actually sold to the Americans because they were so scared of being invaded by the British that they sold it for ridiculously cheap, and obviously that's been a pretty good investment. And it's also very interesting because lots of the places in Alaska, including the capital, which by the way, next to Fairbanks there's a place called the North Pole, and at the North Pole they have like a Santa's address where you can actually like send gifts. It's a weird little thing, but yeah, such as Fairbanks and such as Barrow, which is my favorite example, are literally not connected to anything else. You cannot, sorry, Barrow's just over here, sorry. You actually, these places aren't connected to anywhere else. You just kind of fly in and then there's roads around the place, which is so crazy and bizarre to me, given that it is, you know, kind of this separate state that's all the way out already. Then you have to fly from this separate state to the very particular places, which is a very interesting thing about Alaska, which, by the way, again, one more time, absolutely giant, covers this whole thing, but also covers these islands going towards Russia. Anyway, with that said, for some reason it just flipped over there. Let's move over to the next, the non-continuous state, which is Hawaii. So Hawaii is kind of like the opposite of Alaska. It's, which is very big and very sparsely populated. Hawaii, obviously, is very small and has over 1 million people living there, more than Alaska, which is very, very intriguing, which means it's very, again, dense because it's just a few islands. The capital is Honolulu, and the interesting thing about Hawaii to me is because, again, if you're just kind of taught the broad strokes of World War II, then you know about the Pearl Harbor bombing, right? However, Pearl Harbor was actually on Hawaii, so even though like the big speech was like, this is American soil, and it was, I don't think it was officially a state at the time, but you know, even though it was American soil, you got to bear in mind, Hawaii is kind of not what you picture when you picture American soil. It's all the way out there, almost as close to Japan as it is to the US, which is just something interesting. Again, I'm not talking about the history, it's just an interesting little part of it that you might have missed if you're not from the US, or, you know, you just hadn't heard that till just now. Anyway, that leaves us with 48 more states to go through, even though we just spent like a solid minute in both of those, but they're important states to keep out of the way because, you know, we're not going to see them later on, whereas the rest of the states we're going to be seeing pretty frequently, such as the West Coast, which is where we'll go next. So, the West Coast is made up of 3 states, nice, easy, we're keeping this going pretty fast. We've got Washington, named after George Washington, because it came from the Washington Territory. Exactly why they went for confusing name, given that the capital is Washington, DC, is slightly beyond me, but yeah, there is Washington over here, well known for Seattle and the Cascadia Mountains. Then we've got Oregon, which is just below it. Oregon, obviously, I think the most famous thing about Oregon is the Oregon Trail, right? Because famous game named after a famous trail, which now, by the way, even though it doesn't follow it directly, there is, highways along a similar route to the old Oregon Trail. It's the, I think it's the 80 and then the 84, so that's a cool little fact about Oregon. And then finally, the more famous of the 3 is California. So California is the most, it's this most populated US state by a pretty decent amount. It's also, got 4 of the 10 most, populated cities in the US, LA, San Jose, San Francisco, and San Diego. As well as that, it's really notable because it has the most populated county, which is Los Angeles County. It's a very, very densely populated state. It's a very diverse state in a whole bunch of ways too, with a very, very, very vibrant. I think it's like the most successful economy of all of them by a decent amount. It's basically the most successful US state in a whole bunch of different metrics if you're just going by pure scale. And it's really interesting because, again, even though it's known for having Silicon Valley, which if you're curious is near the San Francisco area, it's more close to San Jose, but there is Silicon Silicon Valley, of course, but then there's all the movie industry stuff. Then it's well known as having like a really decent farming industry inside the rural areas. It's a just massive state, and it's if you separated it, if for some reason you say, oh yeah, 49 states on one side and then California the other, it would be the 6th largest economy in the world. It's a bigger economy by itself than France, and yeah, the size and scale of California, and really the impression that most people outside of America get of America is from California. That's that's something that you can't really kind of separate as much as some people would like to. California is like more than it's more than 10% of the US by pretty much every metric, and that is why calling them 50 individual states is kind of unfair in some ways if you wanna, because you can't really apply the same significance to a place like California that you would to I'm gonna be mean to a state here, Wyoming, for instance, which is where we'll talk about next actually, because the next few states are mountain states. So yeah, Wyoming is interesting because it's the least populated US state with just over 500,000 people living there. Again, put it in comparison to California's like double-digit millions and like 30-40 million. You compare that to that, and it's significantly lower. And the interesting thing about Wyoming to me is the fact that it has super square borders. I mean, most of the borders on the west coast are a lot more square than on the east coast because they're more recent states, and that's kind of why. But yeah, this is I like Wyoming's bordering. So let's say something positive there. But yeah, let's talk about the mountain states because so these are the west coast ones, obviously, because they're bordering the Pacific coast, I guess you call it, of America. But then we've also got the mountain states, which are roughly defined by mountain time and the fact that they have lots of mountains. Or I guess mountain time is roughly defined by the mountains in the mountainous states. And yeah, the mountain states are generally considered to be Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. Utah, very, very interesting state because it's the only state which has a majority of Mormons, or again, some people think that term is offensive, so Latter-day Saint Church of Latter-day Saint, followers, is in Utah. Again, very interesting history behind how that whole thing happened. And yeah, Salt Lake City, very, very close to an actual Salt Lake, which, or at least that's how it was taught to me in school, which I found to be very, very fascinating. And then we got Colorado, very well known for, I think the biggest thing, like, internationally is, like, the legal weed thing, right? Because first state to do it, even though it's not officially properly allowed. But it's also a really interesting case study if you care about that whole thing. So yeah, drugs or something in Colorado, biggest city, Denver, and also a really big hub for a lot of cross-continental flights, including Southwest. So yeah, you might, if you take a flight from somewhere in the US to somewhere else and you're having a stop, it will probably be in Denver if it's in this area anyway, or Denver, or I think it's Dallas as well. But yeah, with that said, so we got the mountain states covered, which can sometimes also include Arizona and New Mexico. Arizona is the most interesting. It's one of the most well-known states for something you probably don't know is there, because Arizona has the Grand Canyon, which is just north of Phoenix. Phoenix is, of course, their biggest city too. Then we've got New Mexico, which is again, it's a name that's like easily to get forgetting because it's like, oh yeah, well, all the other countries used a lot of parts of the US used to be called like the New Netherlands or New England, and New Mexico is kind of a similar story. So like it's on the border as well. There are lots of interesting facts about New Mexico. Also Albuquerque. I love the name and I love the pronunciation of the whole thing. So that also forms part of the Southwest, by the way. So again, these are like mountainous states. Sometimes these are considered, but not always. They're generally more considered to be part of the Southwest US, because when you consider the South in America, there's kind of two sides of it. There's the Southeast, which is the more traditional, like, deep South kind of thing, and there's the Southwest, which is like the kind of South mixed with a bit of like Mexican culture stuff. So yeah, the Southwest is generally considered to be Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, and then sometimes you also throw in Colorado and Utah. Again, the definitions of all the places kind of get a bit hazy when you go toward there's 50 states, you can kind of include a lot of them the same way. But yeah, Texas is the biggest of the ones I just mentioned. Texas, very, very notable for being an independent republic at one point, and in fact, I'd say their population is perhaps known the best for wanting to kind of be independent, like, not necessarily all the way fully on, but yeah, they're the second most populated US state, they're the second largest by area too. There's they've got like loads of significant things about them, and they also have lots of the biggest cities, including the fourth biggest city in the US, Houston, which is just over here, and Dallas is the capital if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, Houston is really interesting because it's one of the 4 major population centers in America. There's in terms of the top 4, there is LA, there is Chicago, there is Houston, and there is New York, which I really love because they kind of form like a little square where there's like one in the north, one in the west, one in the east, one in the south. Anyway, I was just talking about New York and the east. That's another very, very famous, so we've kind of covered the Southwest now. Let's talk about the East Coast, because once we've spoken about the West Coast, it's like, okay, we got all of those down, and then you got the ones that kind of border the ones the West Coast. What about the East Coast? Because this is where the more I feel like this is where the US was founded, this is where the borders get a bit weirder, and this is where things can kind of be confusing if you're not up to date with your US stuff, so let's kind of guide you through it. So let's start with the 13 original colonies, the things that eventually became the first 13 states of the US, because there was Massachusetts, there was New York, there was New Hampshire, there was Connecticut, there was Pennsylvania, there was New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Those 13 states, I hope I said 13, were the original 13 stripes on the original 13 stripes on the flag, which is why, by the way, if you're curious, like, the 13 stripes never change, but the stars do. So, yeah, these 13 states get both a star, both a star and a stripe, so isn't that pretty cool? And, these 13 states were the ones that originally decided to have the war to overthrow the UK. They weren't actually the only colonies off England at the time, or again, the Great Britain, whatever we call it. There was actually 7 others, but they eventually became Canada, and that is why there is the divide there. That's, like, again, there was lots of colonies off the UK at the time, but those 13 came together, formed the United States of America, and that is why they're the first 13. The 14th state is really interesting to me because it is Vermont, so first state to join afterwards, one of the very few states which was like an independent republic for a little bit, first state to ban slavery, and second least populous state just after Wyoming, so there's Vermont right there. Also famous for being the place where the Ben and Jerry founders are from, so there's a thing you now know about the place. As well as that, while we're talking about the East Coast, so the East Coast isn't just the 13 states that first started the US. There's also, Maine there. The reason Maine isn't one of the first 13 is because it used to be part of Massachusetts, so kind of counted. Then we've got West Virginia, which isn't, again, it's not an East Coast state, but it used to be. It split off from Virginia, which is why, by the way, there is no East Virginia. There is Virginia, and then West Virginia split, so now you know a thing. Then, of course, we've got, as well as that, there is Florida. That wasn't it used to belong to Spain, I believe, at the time, or Cuba. That was eventually one, and that is why Florida was later added, and it's the East Coast state, which is not one of those, and so is Maine. And yeah, the East Coast is what used to be the US, and then it slowly expanded west, which is why you see the states get bigger, more organized, and more planned out, I guess, as you go westward, because these used to be different colonies from much places. New York used to be called New Amsterdam, this Hawaii used to be called the New Netherlands, and lots of other countries had colonies in America. It just eventually all became England and then the United States of America. So there's some history mixed in with your states. But yeah, while we're talking about states, let's talk a little bit about those first 13, just a little bit more, because New York is both a city and a state. The city is about half the population of the state, but there is a bunch more of the state all the way up here, which is included actually in the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is one of the more intriguing, because we can kind of follow that along, can't we? The Rust Belt is one of the more intriguing kind of pieces of the US to me, because it kind of defines, one, not only the elections, but two, the population flow from there is one of the parts of the US which is doing really, really poorly over the past 16 years. Like, if you take the population of Detroit from the past, 16 years, it's down 25%. If you take the population of, Gary in Indiana from the past, same period, like just 16 years, like not a very long time period at all, it's down like 20%. And all of the cities in this area, like Pittsburgh, down 10%, like even as far into Illinois, like Decatur, you're down like 10%. All of these cities are kind of shrinking, which is, by the way, why it's called the Rust Belt, because it's like rusting. Also, it's kind of a play on the fact that it was where a lot of cars were made, and that's why it's kind of rusting. But yeah, it's one that degenerates. Again, it seems, I feel like it's being a mean thing to say, but it's a degenerating part of the US in terms of population. And yeah, that includes parts of the North New York, like Buffalo and the New York side of Niagara Falls, I should clarify, not the Canadian side. It includes stuff like Pennsylvania, again, this kind of corner. It includes Ohio, it includes Michigan, it includes Indiana, it includes some parts of Illinois, some bits of Wisconsin, some bits of Iowa even, and yeah, that is the Rust Belt, which again, it comes up a whole bunch. People say the Rust Belt, and it's kind of confusing what they mean by that, because there's no part on a map that says the Rust Belt, and it's kind of like a loose term of like, oh yeah, that's a belt of states, because it doesn't follow state lines where all the manufacturing jobs are. It's just mostly concentrated in places like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and that's why it's such a key thing that, again, comes up in the whole if you cover the US thing. So anyway, with that said, these are all the states right here. Just there's some fun facts. Michigan is actually like one of the weirdest shaped states because they got this north bit of land up here and it's connected by a bridge but not much else. Again, very bizarre stuff going on there. Also, there is Ohio, which is notable because there has not been a US election, one without Ohio, in over 50 years. Like pretty much every election requires Ohio. It's one of the swing states that kind of wins elections for one side or the other. So that's why Ohio is a very big thing. And that's why, I guess if you follow anything thing about like what the candidates are doing. Ohio is the big one that they're always trying to like swing back and forth. Then we've got Indiana. Indianapolis is known for the big race it has there every year. We've got Illinois, which is known for a whole bunch of things, including Chicago, one of the third biggest city in the US, like I mentioned earlier. It's known for how, again, being very populous, but also both Lincoln and Obama are from there, as well as a whole bunch of other famous US people. It's a very well-known US state, and it used to be kind of like the center, you know, the connecting point between the East and the West. If you wanted to take some goods from the West Coast to the East, you'd go through Chicago. Chicago was like the center of the train, kind of like what, I don't know, London is the UK or something. Chicago used to be that, like, the central point for all of the stuff in the in America, which is kind of cool. Again, railways, not quite so important anymore, but Chicago, still a very well-known city and has lots of crime too. But the funny thing about the crime, as it turns out, because I went to Chicago recently, so is the fact that you can actually look at a map of where it is online. It's almost all in the same area. There's, like, South Chicago's bad. The rest actually isn't, you know, like, there's not many deaths happening there, so there's some good news if you wanted to visit it and you're kind of scared that whole thing. But yeah, that is Illinois, the one of the parts of the Rust Belt, and also part of the Midwest, because the Rust Belt is kind of like the Midwest, but it includes some states that aren't in the Midwest, and there are parts of the Midwest which aren't in there. So that goes as like far as Kansas, or the Dakotas, or the Minnesotas and stuff. And actually, let's talk a little bit about, you know, the other states which are here, such as Iowa. Iowa is very well known for, you know, it's I guess its thing in presidential elections, because it's always the first primary state for a whole bunch of like weird historical reasons. But they've got the first thing in that, their capital, Des Moines, is known for a bunch of insurance firms and stuff. And it's a very interesting state because it is somewhat populated. It is also a swing state, and it is also like this, again, this stark mix of like very, very farm heavy while also having like some big insurance stuff going on there. Again, intriguing state to me, at least. That is Iowa. Then we've got Minnesota just above it, one of the states bordering Canada. Actually, you know what, while we're through that, let's go for the other one which borders Canada, which is North Dakota. Now we've covered the entirety of the border, as you can see right there. Isn't that nice? So yeah, the last state that borders thing is North Dakota. North Dakota and South Dakota are a really interesting case. Again, this is like one where like I almost want to make a statement, so I'm going to try and deliberately avoid making any opiniony stuff, because that's not what I do here. But the fact that there are two Dakotas is a very interesting part of how the US developed. And the cool thing about the Dakotas, that's not like, ooh, that's interesting, let's avoid that, is the fact that they, the president at the time signed both into statehood at the same time, or he signed, you know, one then the other, but he flipped them around so no one would know which one he signed first. So we have no idea which state came into being first. One came into, you know, one became a state seconds before the other, and we'll never know which it was. We can only guess. South Dakota, by the way, but they're very, very lowly populated states, and yeah, South Dakota, known for having the faces, which the names forget. I've lost the names in my head right now. But the faces on the mountain, they're really famous, of the presidents. They're in South Dakota, and not really much else there too. So yeah, with that said, let's move on a little bit south to Nebraska. Nebraska, very interesting because, like Maine, it splits up its electoral votes for president into districts. So it's like the only one of two states which has proportional like representation in that way, or not proportional, but close. And it's also really interesting because their only, you know, House legislature only has one. There's not like a House and a Senate. There's just a one body. And also there's no proper party system there. So isn't that kind of cool? Go Nebraska, doing politics a step ahead of the rest of the US, which I guess isn't really too hard at this point, is it? But yeah, but that is Nebraska over there. The capital is Lincoln, Nebraska, just over here. Another famous place is Omaha. I believe it might be the biggest city. Again, we're a little lost when we go to these states because the two middle states of the US are Nebraska and Kansas. They're kind of hard to categorize in any region. Again, sometimes you can call them the Midwest, and that's generally accepted, but they're really, really close to lots of other definitions. But yeah, we've got Kansas to the south. Kansas contains the very geographic center of the United States of America, which is kind of cool. It's very, very close to Nebraska. Oh, if you only count the 48 continuous ones. And also interesting about Kansas is that Kansas City is not in Kansas. It's actually in Missouri instead, which is, again, very intriguing stuff, because Missouri has two giant cities, one on both edge. There's Kansas City, kind of shared with Kansas, but mostly in Missouri. And then there's also St. Louis, which, again, mostly in Missouri, but shared with Illinois a little bit. Oh, I'll be in St. Louis at some point soon, just a little, like a month after you watch this video. So I'll know a bit more about it then, but for now I can say it's named after a saint called Louis, and there's an arch, and are those good enough facts for you? But yeah, let's move on to the final states that we missed here, because there is just a few now. There are 50 states. It's hard to go into them in any amount of detail, but that's what we've done today with the longest video in the world, because next up we've got Kentucky. Kentucky is very, very intriguing. By the way, If you're curious about why the border from Virginia all the way west is like almost this straight line, it's not quite because, you know, it changes. But yeah, it's because Virginia used to claim a giant amount of the US. Obviously, they had their claim taken away by the federal government. But yeah, that's why that happened. And not only that, but they split into two just with that, like that, which is very intriguing to me. And one of the parts that came off the split Virginia, or the old Virginia territory, was Kentucky. So Kentucky, very, very intriguing to me because it was one of these states during the Civil War which, even though it was pro-slavery, stayed with the Union. Presumably because they'd be evaded. The US's Civil War is something I've read into like once or twice. It's hard to get a grip on it, and it's like, I guess, because, you know, from the outside, it's just kind of taught as the slave wars, but it is a lot more complex than that. And yeah, that is Kentucky, the only state which supported slavery, but would stay with the Union anyway. Again, presumably because it's a border state. Just to the south of Kentucky, you've got Tennessee. Tennessee has 2 time zones because there are 4 time zones in the US. There's Mountain Time, which again doesn't properly follow state lines. There's West Coast Time, or Pacific Time. There's the East Coast Time, and then there's the one in between those, which names escape me right now, which again splits into Tennessee right there. Tennessee is obviously the big city is Nashville, and also is known for Memphis, Tennessee, which if I'm not mistaken is Jack Daniels. I hope I got that one right. And yeah, that is Tennessee right there, and it's also got a ridiculously hard name to spell. Look how many double letters there are. What's that all about, Tennessee? Speaking of double letters, there are too many of in a name. It's Mississippi, just over here. So, yeah, this is Mississippi, named after the river. The interesting thing about Mississippi and the river next to it is the fact that the river follows, the border follows the old boundary of the river and not the new one. So you can see like lots of land is on one side and not the other. It's bizarre, confusing stuff, but it means they have the weirdest border in the world, where some parts, like basically the Mississippi, Arkansas / Louisiana border is kind of tricky. And by the way, all of these states, so Arkansas, Tennessee, and basically just all of these ones, just the south of the line over there, are considered to be part of the South. Generally, you know, outside of America, you call it the South, but officially the term is the Southeast, and it includes Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Yes, right, North Carolina is part of the South. Deal with it, anyone else. Speaking about which, by the way, the Midwest in America is actually the Mid-East, but whatever, we'll call it that anyway. But yeah, so we got the Southeast over here, which also then includes Florida, and Florida, again, it's not quite known for all the Southeast stuff, but the north parts of Florida, especially the Panhandle, are actually very, very much south, which is weird, because the further north in Florida you go, the further south you get. But yeah, Alabama, again, I'm sure everyone has a reputation about that. And Louisiana is just a cool one I wanted to mention before the end here. Just in case you're ever like, oh yeah, where's Louisiana? Because it's one I forgot. It's where New Orleans is, which is a very, 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 very big party city. It's shaped like an L, so you can always be like, oh yeah, it's an L, so it's Louisiana. And one of the cool things about the state to me, I know this is probably not to most people, is the bridge across Lake Pontchartrain. I should have checked the pronunciation for this. Lake Pontchartrain. Yeah, this lake right here. You know, I didn't say the words, you read them. You were pronouncing that wrong in your head. Because the cool thing about this lake is the fact that it's got a bridge over it. They built the bridge because they were like, you know what, can we really afford to keep going around? It takes a solid hour. Nope, we'll build a bridge that takes half an hour. So, yeah, there's this bridge that's so wide that from the center, it's actually like, you can't see land on either side. It's just pure... Well, from a boat you can't. But yeah, you can't see land on either side of this because it's that giant a lake. It's pretty cool stuff if you ask me. But yeah, that is the lake in Louisiana. And that brings us to the end of the 50 states. Going to do a mental check to make sure we've got all of them. I did go through every single one of the states in some form or another. Whether it was brief like Arkansas, where I was like, yep, that's a state in the South. If you want another fact, Bill Clinton's from there. Famous US president, or whether it was a bit more in-depth, I have gone over all the states, and hopefully you learned a thing about at least one of them. If you did all enjoy the video, then I don't know, maybe check out another one. I think there'll be 51 or 52 states in the future, so maybe check out the one about 5 new potential US states. But I don't care, because second channel, don't care, goodbye.